Now, a young teenage Sadie fell in love with this movie. And for some reason, because of this movie, fell in love with Prague.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corrine from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Keep It Fictional, the book lovers podcast from the Port Moody Public Library. This is Sadie, and I will be your host today. Now, I think that as a group, we read pretty widely in a geographic sense. If you look at the range of books that have been mentioned on the podcast, you will find a world tour of settings and locations. That being said, there are so many countries and cities in the world that I think it may be impossible to read something from each and every one. And I'm somewhat sad to say that that's not what we have tried to do for this episode. However, what we have tried to do for today's episode is to bring forward some books that are set in places that may not be mentioned quite as often on our podcast and in literature in general. Now, before we get started with our books, I would like to introduce my book friends joining me. We have Virginia and Emma and Corrine. Now, my book friends, I am curious, do you find yourself drawn to a particular part of the world in your reading? When you're looking for books, are you drawn to a particular country or continent or setting more than others?
I think because of my ongoing quest of BTS reading, I do find myself reading a lot of Korean literature in translation, just because that's where my mind is at. Yeah, so I think outside of something, I'm not usually drawn to any particular geographical reason, but if I see that a book has been translated from the Korean, I will usually pick it up.
I'm kind of the same way with Japanese literature, where I think this is born out of my love for anime and manga. But if I see something that's the author's name looks Japanese or it's translated from Japanese, I'll be like, oh, what's that about? And I'm more likely to pick it up. That doesn't necessarily say I'm guaranteed to read it. But if it is something that sounds interesting to me, then I'm like, oh, that could be fun. So I do really like books in Japan. And lately I've been trying to read more Latin American and specifically Mexican literature translated from Spanish. So I haven't read a ton yet, but I'm trying to seek more of that out in the future.
Yeah, I don't find myself particularly drawn to any place. I think it doesn't really have, as much of an influence in whether I pick up a book or not, what setting it is. I just love to, I think same like everybody else, just, read books from different languages. And I think for me, it's always the inner landscape that is more important, inside the characters that have more of an impact for me than where they lived or what the book is set in. So yeah, I don't think I have a particular country. How about you, Sadie?
For quite a while, I was definitely drawn to anything from Scotland and Ireland. I love traveling in that part of the world. I've been there a couple of times, and so I do quite enjoy literature set in that area as well, mainly just so that I can pretend that I am back there. And then also similar to Emma, I quite enjoy books from Japan. I love kind of the settings of Japanese stories, both historical and modern day. So I think that, yeah, I'm definitely drawn to those. Again, kind of similar to everyone. I don't think that it necessarily guides everything that I read, but I think that, yeah, if I see something that is set in one of those places, it kind of draws me in a little bit more than others. Excellent. Well, I'm excited to see what parts of the world we have chosen for our books for today. So we're going to get right into it with Virginia. What part of the world and what book did you choose?
All right. My book is going to take us to Rwanda in Africa in the 1930s. And one of the reasons why I chose this particular book is because in many ways, I feel like the story of the two main characters are really representing the story of the country itself. So I thought it would be appropriate for today's episode. So the book is called Sister Deborah by Scholastique Mukasonga, and it's translated from French into English by Mark Polizzotti. Our story starts with a girl named Ikritsi. She's always been a sickly child, and her parents have tried so many things, so many remedies to try to help her, but nothing seems to work. So when her mother heard about this woman who has healing powers, she decides to take her daughter to this person, Sister Deborah, much to her father's protest and objection. There are reasons for people, especially the men in her village, to be afraid of Sister Deborah. Sister Deborah belongs to a newer evangelical group that was given permission to settle in and build a church by the local chiefs. Now, Christian churches are quite familiar to the folks of the village. They have them for quite a while, but this group is a little different. Instead of the white European priests, this group is from the States and they are all Black. Yes, there is a male priest also, but the woman, Sister Deborah, seems to be the center of the group. Not only that, if you walk past their church, there seems to be just a lot more noise coming from inside. There's a lot of loud proclamations and a lot of music, just a little bit more spirited than the very solemn Catholic masses that the villagers are used to. Both of these groups, they all preaches the second coming. But the white priest, they talk about Jesus, the Messiah, whereas in Sister Deborah's group, they talk about not a man, but a woman, a Black woman specifically, that is going to descend from the sky, and she's going to carry this seed with her. And this seed is going to spread all throughout Rwanda because Rwanda has been chosen, and that this seed is going to feed everybody, just like the manna in the Bible, and no woman will have to work anymore. As more and more people, especially women, started to join Sister Deborah's group, the men are quite alarmed that their women no longer work in the fields, that they no longer do their housework, and they're no longer fulfilling the duties of a mother or a wife. And there's a lot of gossips about whose wife didn't come home the other night. And so the men got so concerned that they decided to ask the Belgian police to get involved. Now, the police have heard about these cults, these sorcerers from America, this weird country. And they feel that Sister Deborah's group is a threat to their rule. They are undermining their authorities, and they are just surprised that these cults have infiltrated Rwanda. And so they decided that they had to intervene. And after a raid to the church, Sister Deborah disappears. Nobody knows where and what happened to her. Some say that Sister Deborah was killed by the police. Some say that, yes, she was killed, but she has resurrected and you have seen her everywhere. Some say that Sister Deborah has gone into hiding, but nobody really quite knows. After this more of a straightforward factual account of what has transpired, we move into the second part of the book where we hear from Sister Deborah herself. We learn about her life in Mississippi in America. We learn about how she joined the missionary. We learn about how her group chose to come to Rwanda and her inner struggles, how she has to reconcile what she's been told and what she's been taught. It's the Holy Spirit that is working through her, that is giving her the power to heal, giving her the ability to speak in tongues. But there's a feeling inside her that it's not the Holy Spirit, that there's something else that is working through her. And as more visions came to her, as more blackouts and trances happened, she has to acknowledge and accept that there is something else that perhaps the church can't explain, a spirit that seems to speak to her in an African language. And in the last part of the book, we go back to Ikaritsi, the little girl who is now a young woman, who is now living in the States. And she has become this respected scholar in African studies in the States. But she has not forgotten the woman that has given her the chance in life. Sister Deborah, who has healed her. It's only because of Sister Deborah that she's alive today and that she's able to take advantage of all the opportunities that life has given her. So when she hears stories and rumors that Sister Deborah has reappeared, maybe in a different form, she decides to go back to Rwanda to learn the truth once and for all. This book has got an interesting narrative structure. Like I like how you kind of got an outline of sort of what happened, just the facts, and then you start to fill it in with all the details as you hear more directly from our two main characters. There are a lot of unknowns in the book, a lot of speculations, and there's no neat endings either. And I think that reflects in a lot of stories the idea that like who gets to tell the story and whose voice is allowed in these stories. Both of these characters offer us a way to look at the history of Rwanda, the impact of colonialism, and how the colonists, like they assume control by taking over your thoughts, by erasing your beliefs, by establishing that hierarchy that they are superior to what you have before, and that they are here to save you. And how do we find ourselves again when your history has been erased? The author, Scholastique Mukasonga, was born in Rwanda and she now lives in France. And as the author pointed out, she has been writing about Rwandan history so that she can help her to regain that sense of self that she has lost. There are quite a few books of hers that has been translated into English. So if you're looking for another Black author that lives in different other countries around the world to add to your list, there are many, many of her books to choose from. Again, visiting a country that I don't think we have actually gone to yet on our podcast. So thank you for this opportunity to do so. So the book is Sister Deborah by Scholastique Mukasonga and is translated from French into English by Mark Polizzotti.
Thank you, Virginia. Now, I'm curious, and I'm going to ask each of my book friends this kind of as our existential question after you have talked about your book. What drew you to Rwanda as your location for today, or was it more the book that drew you in as opposed to the location?
Yeah, for me, it was the book, something that I just happened to pick up from the library. And it just happens to be in a country that I don't think we have talked about as much. And yeah, so that's more that. I think I was kind of looking at it and I'm like, okay, well, this really does represent the country in terms of the story. So I thought that would be a good one for today.
Well, thank you, Virginia, for sharing that and for bringing us to a part of the world that we have not explored yet. Next up, we are going to look at Corrine's book. What part of the world and what book did you pick for us today, Corrine?
All right. So we're going to a part of the world that has been described as paradise. So think of sparkling sandy beaches. Think of turquoise lapping oceanic water. Think of palm trees swaying in the breeze, the sound of reggae music, relaxing. Think of Sandals Resorts. We are going to Jamaica, a place that many people think is the perfect vacation spot. You go to a resort and all of your whims are catered to. Everything is taken care of. If you need a drink suddenly appears at your side. If you're hungry, a plate of fruit is there. If you want a massage, there's plenty of massages to be had. Swim in the beautiful surf. Sunshine at all times of the day. It's paradise. But in Nicole Dennis-Benn's question, she asks, what about the people who are working in paradise? What about the people who have to prepare the drinks or clean up after the guests or are still left trying to eke out a living after all the tourists have gone home after their perfect vacation? She examines the lives of the people who are part of the cycle of tourism on the island. And Jamaica's complicated relationship with the industry, which essentially props up the economy. So this book was published in 2016. It is her debut novel. It was one of the best books of the year, according to the New York Times. It is a Lambda Award winner. And reading it, you can absolutely see why. I'm going to give the spoiler warning that this book is going to break your heart. And in fact, I had read this a couple of years before and I still continue to think about it to the point where I had to check on our big spreadsheet of Keep It Fictional to see if I've talked about it before, because it's a book that I think of almost every time I see an ad for a Caribbean resort on the SkyTrain. This book has profoundly kind of shaken or reshaped the way that I think about tourism in that area. So it is 1994 and we are in the fictional town of Riverbank. And our story centers around three women whose lives circle around tourism and the fraught history of colonial legacy on the island. We have our matriarch, Dolores, and she essentially traps tourists to buy her trinkets. She is entirely focused on building a better life and a better retirement for herself. She has 2 daughters, Thandi and Margot. Now, both of them are dark-skinned, something that gives Dolores a lot of grief. In the book, she says, dark-skinned girls can never find love. Dark-skinned girls can only work. And so she neatly divides her daughters in 2. One of them, Margot, is going to be the worker. She is going to work for the hotel and make money for the family. Thandi is clever, is smart. So she is going to go to school and become a doctor. As neat as that. But nothing is really that simple. While Dolores has pinned all of her hopes on her daughters, she has neglected to give them any love and support. She knows that life is hard, and she teaches her girls to be harder, specifically Margot. Thandi is the great hope of the daughter. She's the baby. She has a scholarship to a good Catholic school, and she can make something of herself. But she's also extremely aware of the pressures on her. She spends most of her pocket money on whitening skin cream so that she can be more beautiful and more popular at school. While she's buying the skin cream, she falls in love with a fisherman's son who would absolutely not meet with Dolores's approval. Now, Margot, I would say, is the protagonist of the novel, and she is complicated. Now, Margot, again, is the worker. She has been working at this hotel for many, many years to support her sister's schooling. That's her function in the family. She works hard every day, but it's not enough. And so she, like many other women at the hotel, turned to sex work in order to supplement their income. However, this gets her the disdain of her fellow employees, and it's a secret that she has to keep from her family. What makes it much more complicated is that Margot is a lesbian, and she's often sleeping with the white men coming to visit the island to make more money, to fulfill some sort of exotic fantasy of theirs. She has a relationship with Verdine, the only open-out lesbian on the island. However, Verdine is being persecuted by the rest of the community, and so Margot has to keep their relationship a secret. And what about that resort? The resort is looking to expand, looking to push the borders of it further and further, closer to the ramshackle fishing village where the locals live. There is a little bit of protest, but everyone knows that in the contest between the tourism industry and the regular people, the tourism always wins. As I said before, this book is going to break your heart. It is a wonderful portrayal of the realities of the island, the realities of the impact of tourism on a place that is wholly dependent on it. Nicole Dennis-Benn really likes to examine the themes in this and her other novel, Patsy, about race, class, homophobia, the sexualization of young girls, and the socioeconomic disparities, especially coming from her home island of Jamaica. She has a complicated relationship with the island. At 17, she actually left the island to go live in the United States because she keenly felt the racism and homophobia of her town, of her home. However, she loves it and returned in 2010, where her wedding to her wife turned into a media sensation on the island, with people coming to take pictures and newspapers reporting on it. I think that this book does a really good job of giving you a snapshot of a place in a way that you wouldn't necessarily see. Other novels that I've seen set in the Caribbean have mostly focused on the white tourists who are visiting there and their experiences of that paradise, and sometimes kind of stereotypically seeing like the seedy underbelly of it. However, this book is absolutely rooted in the experiences of the people that live there, and looking at how the tourism, how the lingering effects of colonialism and the huge national debt works on each of these individual women, trapping them into lives that they do not want. So if you are never going to a sandals resort, then this book is really good for you. I've never been to Jamaica. I've never been to the Caribbean. but I think that this is kind of like a necessary point of view if you are looking to kind of engage in that tourism, is to kind of realize the impact on it. And above and beyond, it's a wonderfully told story, absolutely like devastating at the end. And again, years later, because I think I read this when it came out, I am still thinking of it. I follow the author on Instagram. I want to know what she's up to. Hopefully writing another book soon. That would be great. Patsy came out a little while ago, but I know like genius takes time. So I'll be patient.
Thank you so much, Corinne. Now, same question that I asked Virginia. What kind of drew you to that setting? I know you said that you read the book a couple of years ago. Was it the setting that drew you in at all, or more the book? And kind of what made you want to pick that one?
I think I definitely picked this one up. It's got a great kind of like great cover, great title, Here Comes the Sun, which is a very like chipper Beatles song. But I think that the setting did play a part in making me want to read it, because it's a place that I know so little about the contemporary literature there. And at the time, there is Book of Since, who was doing a Read Caribbean challenge over Instagram. And this was one of the books that kind of like came up in a list to read for it. And so I thought it would be a really interesting opportunity to read such like a lauded debut set in somewhere that I could stand to learn a little bit more about. And it did not disappoint.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for sharing that and for bringing us to a part of the world that some of our listeners may have visited on their own. But yeah, I think that definitely will kind of open people's eyes to what happens once those resorts are kind of pushed to the side and we look at what's happening behind them. All right. Well, I am going to go next and going to start my book talk today with a little bit of a story. Bear with me. Humor me. On January 9th, 2004, the truly amazing teen comedy romance movie, Chasing Liberty, was released. Now, this movie stars the just broke out of her pop star fame to enter acting, Mandy Moore, and the mostly unknown at that point, and maybe even still today, Matthew Goode. It tells the story of the daughter of the president who wants nothing more than freedom and a chance to go to the Berlin Love Parade. But as she is the president's daughter, she gets neither. And so, while she is on a visit with her father to Prague, she slips away from her bodyguards and begs a young man on a motorcycle to help her escape. Little does she know that this man is in fact working for her father the entire time. Thus begins an epic tour through Europe where she thinks that she has freedom. He is making sure that she doesn't do anything stupid. Chaos and romance and betrayal ensues, and we end with maybe a happy ending. Now, a young teenage Sadie fell in love with this movie, and for some reason, because of this movie, fell in love with Prague. I knew nothing of Prague at the time, and honestly, in the movie, they are only there for about 10, maybe 15 minutes at the most. But when I saw this movie, it made me want to go to Prague so much. Now, Prague is a city steeped in history, in tragedy, in mystery. Mysteries quite often surrounding alchemy and magic, old buildings and winding dark alleys. I still haven't been, and it is still on my bucket list. And so the next best thing to actually visiting a city in real life is to visit a city in a book. And so that is why, for the episode today, I chose a book that was set in Prague. Now, this book has actually been on my radar for a while, and I'm a little embarrassed to say that it was because of the original cover that I stayed away from it. The cover itself is fine. It shows a woman's face wearing like a feathered masquerade, kind of blue feathered masquerade style mask. It just never really drew me in. And after reading the book, it doesn't really feel that representative of what the book actually is. I think that the new cover is more accurate and more representative of the story. So this is The Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor, and tells the story of 17-year-old Karu. Now, Karu is not your typical teenager. She's an art student at the Art Lyceum of Bohemia, which is a private high school in Prague. She speaks many languages, most with an absolutely perfect accent. She lives by herself. She is covered in tattoos, including 2 eyes on the palms of her hands, which she can't ever remember not having. Her hair grows out of her head a bright blue color, though she tells everyone that it's dyed. And she has no idea who her real family is. She loves to sketch, and she fills her sketchbooks with magical creatures called chimera. One with horns and the head and legs of a ram, the torso of a man, and crocodile-clawed feet. She calls him Brimstone. Or the snake woman named Issa, or the man with the giraffe neck named Twigga, and many, many others. Karu's best friend, Susanna, along with other students in her class, love to look at her sketchbooks and immerse themselves in the beautiful fantasy world that Karu has created within its pages. What Susanna and the others don't know is that Brimstone, Issa, Twigga, and all the others are not a fantasy. They're not a creation of Karu's mind. They are her friends, her family, and they are 100% real. And so are the dangerous and, if Karu's being honest, sometimes rather exciting adventures she goes on. Now, Brimstone is like a father to Karu. He raised her, but he's also her boss. And usually at the most inconvenient moments, Karu will be summoned to complete tasks for him. Usually the retrieval of teeth. Human teeth, animal teeth, it's always something different. What Brimstone does with the teeth, Karu is not really sure. And she's tried asking enough times to know that she's never going to get an answer. So she continues to travel all over the world by way of magic doors to meet with his suppliers to trade items, retrieve teeth, bid at auctions, or on the very rare occasion to steal something priceless and have to run for her life. Once it ended in her being shot. Something she tries not to think about. Now she gets rewarded for her work with wishes. Not very big wishes. Nothing that could change her life, like wishing to fly. But small things. Things like being able to perfectly speak a language, or make it so she never has to re-dye her hair to the preferred blue color. Brimstone can grant bigger wishes. He'll often trade them for more sought-after items from the world's criminals. But he never gives them to Karu, something for which she's just a tiny bit bitter. Karu knows that Brimstone and the others aren't the only ones of their kind. However, she's never allowed to venture further into their world than the shop in which Brimstone does his business, the shop where Karu herself lived as a child. And Karu listens to them, for the most part, and continues to do her work and live her normal life in Prague. On the other side of the world, Akiva knows what he must do. Along with his brother and sister, he is responsible for marking the doors. Each and every one. They will mark the doors and try to stay out of sight. If they are seen, they appear somewhat human, as long as you don't look at their shadows. Those that do will notice the addition of a huge set of feathered wings. An illusion. It must be. Now, Karu is starting to get frustrated. Every day this week, Brimstone has called her away from class, from dinner and drinks with Susanna, from sleep, to go fetch one thing or another. Every single day. She can't take it anymore. So when his newest summons comes, she decides to ignore it. She knows Brimstone will be angry, but she wants a life too. She can't just be his to command. And so, after dinner with Susanna, when she finally heads to Brimstone's shop, she's not surprised to find that he's mad. However, what she is surprised is that he also seems oddly sad and sentimental, talking about how he knows at some point he will have to say goodbye. He will have to let her go. She's not quite sure what he's talking about, but accepts his assignment and leaves for Marrakesh, Morocco, to go see one of his best human teeth suppliers. However, after her meeting, she is shocked to see somebody else watching her. A man who really doesn't look human. Beautiful, but in a dangerous, terrifying way. She starts to make her way back to the portal as fast as she can and is followed. When the man attacks her with a huge sword, Karoo knows she's in trouble. Now, Karoo is a trained fighter, but she's no match for this thing with its superhuman speed and strength. In a last effort to beg for her life or ward him off, Karoo isn't sure which. She flings up her hands, and out of the 2 eye tattoos come streams of pure power. They knock the man back long enough for Karoo to get back to the shop, where she is found and luckily patched up by Isa. Now, Isa tells her that Brimstone isn't there and then leaves her alone to recover from her injuries. This is the first time Karoo realizes that she is in the shop by herself. Now, wanting answers, Karoo decides to go exploring. What she finds, she can't wrap her head around. A cavernous basement with stone tables filling the space. Each one is covered by a creature, a chimera, ones that Karoo has never seen before. Dead, she imagines. But when she approaches one with a wolf's head, she learns very quickly that they are very much alive. Brimstone enters just in time to save her from the wolf, but he is so furious that he banishes Karoo, injuries and all, from the shop, refusing to speak to her. The next morning, each and every door that acted as a portal into Brimstone's world burns. They burn and they don't stop burning until they have all disappeared. And along with them, Karoo's way back to her family and the answers that she is now desperately needing. Answers about who she is, what her past was, and what her actual connection is to Brimstone, Issa, and the others. And what her connection is to the strange, winged, sword-wielding man named Akiva who attacked her. Karoo finds herself making alliances with those she never thought she would and revealing more to her human friends than she ever planned. All so that she can find answers, find her family, and survive. This book was not at all what I expected. I would say that the first half of the book and the second half of the book are very, very different. I preferred the first half. I think it is more set in the real world. Karoo and her secret life is still secret. More time actually spent in Prague, which is why I was drawn to the book in the first place. As the book goes on, the story and the connections between the characters get very, very complicated. I found that I wasn't fully being able to buy into it as much as I would have wanted to. It has a very strong, star-crossed and forbidden lovers theme, along with a meant to be together trope, which I've mentioned is not my favorite. Definitely not my favorite. For the most part, that being said, I did like Karoo as a protagonist. I could empathize with her and her kind of lack of understanding about what is actually happening in her life. That being said, there's a huge reveal about 3/4 of the way through the book. And after that, I didn't like her quite as much. I don't know why that changed my opinion on her, but I did. And it was kind of during that part of it that I started to lose interest in the book. I think that Laini Taylor does a good job of making you want to keep reading, just in the way that she kind of builds suspense and adds in these reveals and things like that. And so I think that that definitely kept me going until the end of the book. However, apart from just feeling like I had to kind of follow that suspense build, I was not fully engaged by the end of the book. And I don't think I will actually be reading the rest of this series. Yeah, so not a glowing review, I will say. But it did bring me to the streets of Prague, at least in the beginning. I actually, full disclosure, I read 3 books for this episode. I'm just at the very end of one of them. I listened to the audiobook. The other 2 are more based in Prague than this one was. They kind of deal more with the kind of alchemy and magic and history and mysteries of Prague than this one does. I think Prague is more just a setting as opposed to being an actual part of the story. So maybe I should have talked about one of the other ones, but who knows? Who knows? The other one had way more random sex in it than I had remembered from the first time I read. And so I don't know if I wanted to talk about that. Yes, Grace.
I know exactly what book you're talking about.
Do you? Do you?
I know exactly what book you're talking about, because she shows up in Prague and then they're all of a sudden having sex. And I was like, did I miss something? Girl, you got off an airplane.
Yeah. And no, it is very, very strange. And I read it years ago and I really liked it years ago. And I reread, I'm like, I don't remember this being like this. I don't. Oh gosh. So I opted not to talk about that one. So I went with this one, and you know what? Not a glowing review, maybe not the most representational of Prague as a city, but that is okay. If you are looking for something that kind of has some reveals in it, some weird shifts halfway through the story, I will say which one thing I did mention, if you are interested in YA fantasy surrounding angels, this would be a good one for you. Yeah, I think that there's definitely merit to it. I think that the story does draw you in and want to keep you reading a little bit. Yeah, and it does bring you to Prague. So if you're interested in that part of the world, it's The Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. All right. Well, I think I did say why I was drawn into that one, why I wanted to read a book about Prague. So we are going to go now to our final book. Emma, what location and what book did you talk about today?
All right. It's funny that we're ending with me because my book did have a lot of sex in it, and I also didn't really care for it that much. So we're ending on a positive note today. My book takes place in Turkey, and I found my book I was browsing a bookstore. I was at a bookstore with Kate, and I was kind of thinking about future KIF themes and like looking for books that I could specifically read for future KIF themes. And when I saw this one, I was like, that's an author's name that sounds like it comes from a country that's probably not often represented on our podcast. And the book is short, and I will like pretty much always read anything if it's under like 200 pages, regardless of whether or not I think it's bad. And so when I took a look at the book, I was like, oh, this is compared to other books that I've really enjoyed before. It's got a lot of similar themes to the literature that I am drawn to. This book is very much like depressing psychological autofiction, which I pretty much always enjoy when I read books like that. It's compared to books like The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I thought it was really similar to No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. So it didn't take very long to convince myself to pick up this book. But yeah, I pretty much just grabbed it because the author sounded like they were from a country that wasn't represented. And then when I looked them up, I was like, oh, they're Turkish. I don't think any of us have ever read or talked about a Turkish book before. So I thought it would be perfect to read for this episode. So this book is called Cold Nights of Childhood by Tezer Özlü. And I do have to provide a content warning at the beginning. This book is quite depressing. It has really detailed descriptions of the protagonist's mental illness, and there are discussions of suicide in it. So just leaving that on the table before we get started. This is the first and only of Özlü's books to be published in English. She had previously published a few books in Turkish and German before her early death in 1986 at the age of 43. But the English translation for this one was done by Maureen Freely, and it came out in 2023. So it took quite a while to get it translated into English. But it's considered a classic of Turkish literature. So it was kind of a big deal when they finally came out with it in English. The story itself is very disjointed. So for those of you that like an A to B to C to D kind of narrative structure, it's definitely not a book for you then. It is very fragmented, and it's got kind of a sort of chaotic episodic narrative where the scenes jump very, very rapidly. A lot of the scenes are based on some of the author's own experience, so I would kind of describe it as autofiction. And the narrator is never named in it. It's a little bit vague as to like who these people are and where exactly this book is taking place. But we start in kind of the rural provinces of Turkey in the 1940s and 50s. And we later move to Istanbul, where our narrator goes to school and kind of spends the majority of her adolescence. At the beginning, she describes the house that her parents raised her in, along with her older brother and her sister and her grandmother. And her father kind of runs this household like a military. He wakes them up with a whistle. He marches through the house in his pajamas shouting with a voice that sounds like a bugle. He sings a lot of like patriotic Turkish, like national songs, national anthems. And the narrator asks herself why her father and other men of his generation are like this, why they treat their families like their own personal armies. She's very critical from the get-go of many of the adults in her life, and especially of her parents' marriage and her own impression of it. Her mother is very much duty-bound, and she's content with being in this sort of loveless marriage. And her father is very traditional and very patriarchal, which seems to be a theme with other Turkish men of his generation. They live with her grandmother as well, who is self-sacrificing, and she's devoted to doting on her adult son, her youngest baby. And the narrator says that her brother has it very easy. He gets his own room, he gets his own collection of books, his own privacy and his own freedom to be independent, kind of all of these luxuries that the narrator and her sister are not able to have. They're kind of forced to share their space and forced into these more confining roles of femininity. So from early in childhood, the narrator often thinks about death, and she muses about suicide with this kind of frighteningly nonchalant tone. At one point, she says, "Day and night, I think of killing myself. My reasons are unclear. To carry on with life or to die, either will do." And she's like a child, like a young child when she talks like this. So it's quite upsetting. When she's a young child, she attempts suicide. She thinks of it as a sort of revenge against the oppressive houses and teachers and rules that she's been confided to. She takes pills in the middle of the night and wakes up in a psychiatric hospital. So from that episode, she wakes up in the hospital, and the book almost immediately jumps to her talking about her grandmother. She talks about her grandmother being very traditional, being a very devoted Muslim. She describes her grandmother as someone who loves life and takes great interest in talking about her own funeral. She talks about how like she wants all the papers to report on it. She wants all these people to be there. And there's a few moments like that where I got this sort of whiplash throughout the book where like you start learning more about one aspect of the narrator's life. You start kind of getting into her mental illness and kind of these more morbid thoughts that she has as a child. And then the book immediately pivots to talking about something different without giving you enough time to really sit in whatever that like previous topic was. And I typically enjoy books that are like that. I typically like books that don't have a straightforward narrative structure. But I think because this book was so short, it is only like 100 pages cover to cover. It didn't really spend enough time in one theme for me to get really invested in it before it immediately switched into something else. So I did find it a little bit difficult to really get to know and care about this main character because we just didn't really have a lot of time in any instance throughout her life. So I was left wanting to know more about her mental illness as a child and what it was like after her suicide attempt. And I was immediately thrown into her grandmother's funeral after that. And then it shifted over to talking about her school days. So it was a little bit disjointed at times. The writing was very vivid and very lyrical, but it was a little bit disorienting. And since it kind of jumps from episode to episode without any clear transition, without any sort of chronological order, it was oftentimes confusing to really understand what was going on. Although I will say that I think the book takes these ideas of living in like a very claustrophobic and oppressive environment and really shows them in its writing. The writing itself feels quite claustrophobic. It's very rambly. It's very complex and confusing at times. But I also think that this is how the narrator was feeling throughout a lot of her life as she's trying to like reconcile with what she's going through. So I think the writing pretty accurately reflects her psychological state in that it was very disjointed and kind of complex and confusing. She deals a lot with her psychological struggle and also her feminine desire. There's a lot of sexual desire that's approached as a topic in this, especially within this very repressive and patriarchal society in Turkey in the 20th century. We follow our narrator through various different sexual experiences throughout the book, beginning with sexual experimentation with her sister, content warning for incest, and her female cousins and when they were very, very young children. And then as they get a little bit older, as they hit puberty, they start talking more about boys. She goes to an all-girls Catholic school, so they're gossiping about boys, dating boys throughout her adolescence. And then later, as an adult, she starts to date these like intellectual men that she meets in bars and cafes. And she's got this hope that with these men, she'll no longer feel the same loneliness that she felt throughout her childhood. And then the latter half of the book kind of jumps around between these various men that she sees and has sexual experiences with them. Some of them are husbands, many of them are not. There's a lot of infidelity going on. And I found the latter chunk of the book very confusing and disconnected since the author uses such little description throughout it, both for the men that she's with and for the places that she's in. There's references to specific neighborhoods and like locales and cafes and joints in Istanbul. But other than that, I found it a little bit difficult to understand exactly where they were and when they were in different parts of the narrator's life. And all of the men that she talks about having sexual relations with are very non-specific masculine figures. that the author has like little to no love for, including her multiple husbands. So it's kind of hard to follow, like, which husband are you with now? Okay, and then you got pregnant by somebody else, and then now who are you with? And now you're with somebody else. Like, it was very much like jumping all over the place, which for such a short book was, in my opinion, a bold choice. But alas, I didn't write it. So yeah, a lot of the latter part is just kind of talking about how all of these different sexual experiences are impacting her life, but they very much jump from one person to another really quickly. Made this section of it really depressing. And on top of that, these descriptions of all these different men are interwoven with various different stints in psychiatric hospitals. So the narrator experiences a variety of different episodes and receives electroshock treatments that only worsen her mental state. So as a whole, book was a little bit upsetting. It did remind me quite a bit of The Bell Jar, which I really enjoyed when I read it in university, as well as No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. But what I preferred about those two books is that they take a lot more time in each scene. So the reader can actually get a feel for what's going on, get to know the setting of the book, get to know the side characters, and really kind of be fully immersed in the internal psyche of the protagonist. While with this book, we do spend the entirety of the book inside of the protagonist's psyche, but it's so kind of chaotic and how quickly it shifts from one thing to another. It was hard to really get a feel for how she was feeling. It felt like it tried to fit the same message that those other two books do about like artists and specifically women being oppressed in a society that tries to confine them. But in my opinion, because it didn't really take that time, the message didn't quite land. So I was a bit disappointed by it, especially because like by the description, it really sounded like something that I would enjoy. And I love a short book. So that was something that drew me to it. But it is considered a classic in Turkish literature. It was pretty monumental when it was finally translated into English in 2023. So for readers that like short psychological fiction, readers who like reading about mental illness, or who'd want to read kind of an unflinching portrayal of psychological struggles, you'd probably enjoy this book. It is very frank about the kind of struggles that she's dealing with. Or if you're like us here at Keep It Fictional and you're trying to read more literature from countries and cultures that you haven't read much from, this one was from Turkey. I have to admit, I was a little bit disappointed about how little I learned about Turkey through this book. She does like name very specific kind of restaurants and bars and cafes and neighborhoods. But because I don't know any of these places in Istanbul, those references kind of went over my head. And it doesn't really describe what a lot of these places are like in great detail. So I didn't get a ton of insight into what it was like being a woman or being a girl in Turkey during this specific time. But overall, it was really interesting to kind of get a new perspective from a country and a culture that I haven't really read much. So this book is Cold Nights of Childhood by Tezer Özlü, translated into English by Maureen Freely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. I think you kind of answered the question as kind of what drew you into that book in the first place. So thank you for that. Now, I'm going to spring one further existential question onto my book friends that I have not told them about because it just popped into my head. So I'm going to pose to all of you, is there a part of the world that you wish there was more literature from that you would like to read about?
Like constantly. I think it's really interesting. There was a blog of a woman who is trying to read one book from every country in the world. And it was such an interesting exploration because there were so many countries with like these great works of literature, like these national treasures that had never been translated. And so as more people kind of learned about her project, there were translators that kind of came in from the wings to make sure that, you know, she was able to kind of meet that. And so I think that was just such an interesting reflection of like what countries get translated, what countries don't get translated. And so I think that there's so much that we want to discover. I think personally, just because I have one waiting at home right now, more books from like the Philippines or kind of like Southeast Asia. I don't think there's a ton of translation that makes its way over here to North America. So I think that would be kind of an area that I'd love to see more of.
So a book that I had been reading it was interesting reading Sister Deborah at the same time. I finally got my interlibrary loan for The Language of Languages by Ngugi wa Thiong'o that I talked about on the Black History Month episode. And that book talks a lot about African languages and writers that are not allowed to write in their own languages, that they have to do so much through the lens of a colonist language. He's talked a lot about how we can encourage translation from an African language to another African languages rather than having to translate into English or French or all these authors that have to write in those particular languages, and having that dialogue between the different places that are in Africa, because there's just so many different languages there that are getting lost. So I think having that in mind, I was kind of thinking it would be great to see, first of all, I think nurturing that and just seeing a lot more projects that people can actually write in their own languages first. And then at some point we'll get to see them. But I think it's really important that they get a chance to communicate among themselves first before having to deal with the other kind of translation that is expected, and he talks a lot about kind of this hierarchy of languages that have been established that somehow if you want to show that you have intellectual thinking, it has to be done in English or French, which is ridiculous. And he mentioned how there was a prize that was established specifically to celebrate African literature. But the criteria is that you cannot write in African language. You have to write in English, which is just bananas. And so just kind of having read that book and, thinking about when he talks about that, I would love to see that there are a lot more books that are written in those languages, and that maybe that they get to translate, among each other first, that I can't read yet, but that's okay. I think it's important that that happens.
I feel like for me, I just need to be better at seeking out books from other countries, because it's not that these books don't exist, that they haven't already been translated. It's just that I haven't read many books from South Asia. I haven't read many books from the central part of Asia where Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, I haven't read a lot of books from those regions as well. So I think I personally, this is motivating me to be better at seeking out books from all these other regions and kind of not just sticking with what I'm comfortable with and the kinds of books that I know I really enjoy, but also kind of going off of Virginia's point, it'd be really cool to see more books that are written in indigenous languages from South America, rather than just books that are written in the colonizer's language, written in Spanish. Although I don't speak those indigenous languages, so obviously they'd have to be translated. But it would be really cool to see more literature published in these indigenous languages where the cultures have been affected by colonization.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of along the same lines as you, Emma. I think I need to be better at seeking them out. One part of the world, though, that I think that there's a lot of outside perspectives written about it is Egypt. And I think that there's a lot of books that are set in Egypt, mainly kind of sometimes ancient Egypt or Victorian times Egypt, where it's being told almost from an outside perspective of colonizers going in, because that was kind of a lot of what was happening at that time. And so I think that I'd be really interested in reading more from an actual modern day perspective from people from Egypt and kind of hearing their stories as well. Because I think that we, as a world, we know a lot about the history and a lot about the ancient Egyptians, but not as much maybe about modern times. So that would be an area that I would be curious, and maybe I will start to seek out more books about that part of the world. Well, thank you, everyone, for talking about different books from different parts of the world. And hopefully, listeners, we have encouraged you to seek out some books from a part of the world that maybe you don't read about quite as often. Take a vacation to somewhere that you've never been through the words in a book and immerse yourself in another culture and another world that might be outside of your own. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next time on Keep It Fictional.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.